Welcome to the final lecture for the Psych Lab, Psych 140, Developmental Psych. Um, this is technically the last lecture, okay? So your final test 3, is going to be on chapters 12, 14, which are both the videos that already exist, and then 16, which is this one. Now, I had said earlier that if there was interest, I would do chapter 18, which is on later life, and chapter 19 on death, dying, and bereavement, and then also the dreams presentation. And I will still do that, especially if you guys are all interested in it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this one, and then you have all the content that you need for the final test. Okay, and then since the term ends kind of next week, once the dust is settled, I'll get into those other ones just so I can give them proper time, and since they're not related to your evaluations. Okay, enough with the chit chat. Slide 2. Okay, so last week, just to give a quick kind of summary since our last test. So the last 2 weeks we've been looking at how a lot of these developmental psychology ideas translate to the kind of middle stage of life. And we started off looking at chapter 12, where we were talking about social and personality development in adolescence. And we talked a lot about identity formation and how so much of adolescence is around who we are and who we're not and who we fit in with and what behaviors we do and what behaviors we don't do and all that kind of stuff. And then last week we talked about, or last presentation, which was also this week, I talked about chapter 14, early adulthood, right? And all these issues around intimacy and isolation. And then today, this last chapter that you're going to be tested on, we're going to be talking more about middle adulthood, okay, and some of the developmental issues associated with that, and feeling like we're making some kind of meaningful impact on the next generation. It's my relationship to you guys. I'm going to use that as my example. All right, next slide. So it's probably not a surprise to anyone that our social roles change as we get older. Right, and remember, I like this word roles because it implies kind of a theater situation or a movie situation where it's like, and I always say this in class, it's like if I was to say, okay, stop, I would never do this, but we're going to do a drama in the middle of class or something, and I'm like, okay, you play a police officer, you play a chef, and you play a librarian. Everyone would kind of know how to act, what was demanded of that role. And it's like we all play these different roles in our lives. It's like we play roles at work, we play roles in relationships, we play roles with our friends, within our family, and it's like we're playing different roles in different movies. And we talked about how a couple chapters ago, how as a teenager, so much of what we call identity formation is bringing some congruence or some completeness, some identity, so that we don't just have role confusion. Role confusion is sort of the opposite of a strong identity, right? Because an identity is something that would cut across those roles. Okay, this tends to be the time in life when we're at the epitome of our career, kind of the best part, right? We're kind of past like the early developmental stages, maybe not burnt out yet. It's kind of when people tend to report the highest levels of work-related satisfaction. Our kids at this time are also tend to be older. Okay, so this is the life stage older than I am now. So right now, I know I look like I'm like in my young 20s, but this old mug is the mug of an almost 40-year-old. And but this stage that is talking about now is probably like kind of the 50, 60, right? So at this stage, a lot of our children are grown and out on their own, so there's less kind of daily task obligation associated with that, less constricting roles, all right, may have more time for oneself. Which again, depending on who you are and your psychology and your behaviors, more time for yourself can be positive or negative. So here's the big word for today. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about Erickson lately, and Erickson, one of the most important psychoanalysts. It's hard to, if you're considering Jung and all those guys psychoanalysts, which you definitely would, it's hard to like rank. I'd say, the second most important psychoanalyst in terms of developmental psychology. When you're saying who's the most influential psychoanalyst, period, well, you'd have to include like Carl Jung and Anna Freud and Adler, a whole bunch of people. Okay, so that's a huge side question because the psychoanalysts are a huge amount of people. Right? If you remember the very first lecture when I was kind of talking about the main schools in psychology, I said that was kind of like that first big school. And almost all psychology that comes after is a response to it, a response to Freud. Even the people that ripped on Freud underestimated how much Freud kind of wrote the underpinning of the whole entire field. It's like it's easy to pick apart a couple mistakes. The guy was writing before there even was a thing, before psychology was even kind of a thing. He didn't have the luxury of brain scans and understanding genetics and understanding, what we now know about, well, just from brain imagery and things like genetics. Those two things alone are enough. And I think, anyways, back to the slide. Generativity. I could go on that Freud thing forever. This is the word for today. So what this means is to think about generativity is just a fancy way to generate something. If I was like, oh, I generated all kinds of new ideas, what would you think I meant? It's like I thought these up, or I made something that wasn't there before. And so to be generative, it's almost like the opposite of the word destructive, right? To be generative, it's like that's what our world needs. It's like me teaching my nephew how to play baseball. That's a weird example, but that's just what came into my head for whatever reason. Will be a generative action. Me, and part of this is my job. Part of this is that I care and love about you guys. It's like me trying hard to explain to you guys a psychoanalytic idea like generativity is actually weirdly an example of generativity. It's like I get something from feeling like if I was gone tomorrow, this all wasn't meaningless. That there's a chain of lineage, and it's like a few of these ideas that we've been talking about have stuck in your head, and that might have changed you, and that might change who you are in your next interaction. It's like, so this wasn't meaningless, and feeling like what you're doing isn't meaningless is actually super important. Actually, to Erickson, it's the most important developmental thing. That you feel like you're having some kind of generative effect on the next generation. Generativity involves an interest in establishing and guiding the next generation. Raising children, teaching, mentoring, taking leadership roles, helping fight the panic or the depression or the isolation psychologically that people are experiencing right now. There's a lot of opportunities for generative action. All right, but this is something that continues through old age. Why it says may continue into old age is because remember right now we're talking about middle adulthood. And what I mean there is like this is also a concept very relevant to late adulthood. It just kind of is highlighted most here. Okay, so now check out this. So this is saying the problem is oftentimes we feel like the lady in this picture. It's like, could you put a few more batteries in my back? Wind me back up because I feel hardcore worn out and stagnated. Stagnation. What does stagnation mean? Think of a pool of water where there's no water going in or out. It's just like a huge puddle of mud water that has mosquitoes in it. It's like that's like a stagnant and unmoving dead pool of water. It's like if we don't, Erickson's what he's saying is actually super deep. He's saying if we can't establish some kind of feeling like what we're doing matters, the chances of feeling stagnated of feeling like almost like the behavioral interpretation of nihilism, like just like nothing's gonna change. It is what it is. Blah blah blah. It's like stagnated. It's dead. Like dead, stagnated water. Stagnation. That failure to develop generativity. Remember, because Erickson's always talking about like this is your goal, and if you don't meet that goal, if you can't form a meaningful connection to the next generation, then it can lead to a sense of personal impoverishment. Think about what personal impoverishment would mean. I said that word weird, but being impoverished personally. It's like unfulfilled, whatever word you want to use. My mind rebels at stagnation. Give me problems, give me work, give me the most abstruse cryptogram. I had to look that up. That's like a puzzle of numbers. Or the most intricate analysis, and I'm in my own proper atmosphere. But I abhor the dull routine of existence. I go crazy when things are boring. I crave mental exhilaration. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Conan Doyle. When I present this in class, I always ask if people know who this guy is. So you're yelling at your screen who it is. So this guy's the author of Sherlock Holmes. So Erickson believed, okay, so now just I'll say this point and then I'll talk about it. How a man responds earlier to childlessness. So how much say you're 25 and you don't have kids. And I say like, how much do you care that you don't have kids? Right? So how you respond earlier in life to that childness question is actually predictive of psychological health later in life. What's that saying? It's like, well, not having kids is kind of only psychologically damaging to you if that's a huge priority to you. All right, but that actually, and I think this is interesting because I think this isn't a common narrative that actually there's, for men, a real, men. I was thinking, is this, just for a second, when I started to make the second point, I was wondering if it was male specific, but yeah, this idea that actually being in the presence of a mentoring scenario, so whether it's raising your own kid or being like a soccer coach or like being involved a martial art coach or something like that, actually brings forth certain psychological qualities that don't come forth in other ways. What? That being in that kind of situation, being in that kind of scenario where you have these demands on you, brings forth psychological qualities that may actually be important parts of your growth. It's like the challenge actually makes you build more parts of you. Now, nurturing qualities. I'm not talking about new parts as in like extra limbs, but it's like another way of saying that in way more simple language is like when Evelyn was born, there's things about being a dad that I didn't even know I needed to learn that I've learned, and it almost felt like it was just programmed in me genetically. And I think a lot of parents could relate to that comment, and I think Erickson's just saying it in more psychological terms. So Valant comes along, right? So this is just another researcher, and he comes along and is looking at Erickson's idea and makes this revision or makes this idea of like, well, maybe it's useful to look at two stages sort of this, two stages within two substages, right? And the first one he calls career consolidation. So here he's saying, well, we start to get into this scenario where, say for example, myself, and even though I'm still way too young for this stage, just joking, I know I'm getting old. I'm starting to get at the stage now where at work I kind of have my own social network, generally satisfied with work-related choices. You kind of start to get into your groove work-wise. You start to consolidate. It's not You're not struggling to get established. You might be still struggling to maintain, but you're at a consolidation, not a development stage. Yeah, I think that rant made sense. Okay, so then that's weird that I had it like that, but it said the other important aspect of this, and we touched on this last week, this idea of a keeper of meaning, or this idea of somebody within the family that is, and I have this picture here of my mother-in-law again, because I use her as the example of somebody that, like, we haven't seen each other for a while, so she'll have a Sunday dinner and everybody gets together and we have a barbecue in their backyard, and it's like, this is me hanging out with her in the, well, where was that? I think that was at Kilbear Park up north. A little bit of a lake swim. Next slide. Okay, just another family picture from that same trip. Had the earbuds in, just checking volume level. Sounds okay. Yeah, I'm the good-looking guy there with the orange plate. Desperate for attention. Okay, next slide. Again, ignore the sweat stain on the shirt of that guy at the top left. But again, just another family picture. Usually at this point in the class, I'm like ranting about that idea of like being the kin keeper, right? And I didn't really explain that on that other slide, but I got going on my side rant. But a kin keeper being somebody that keeps everybody together and that keeps the family tight. Okay, so midlife crisis, fact or fiction. Okay, because this is another interesting part about this is it's also this time in life where you sort of, well, technically are at midlife, but also the research is kind of interesting on this. Like, so this is kind of the question, like, does a midlife crisis actually exist? And I should have had this slide set up differently so the answer is not already there, but it's kind of linked to a few things. Number one, you start to become more aware of the fact that, there's a better way to say it, but that we have an expiration date and that we have mortality. We start to maybe recognize new physical limitations, like a sore back, right, or a bad knee. Start to adapt to major changes in roles. Right, like to switch from being a parent to a grandparent or something like that. So it's kind of interesting because if you look at the psychological literature and developmental psych literature about this question, you find that serious midlife problems are experienced by only a minority, but that's still pretty high, 25%. Right, so that's 1 in 4. So that's basically saying 1 out of 4 people that were surveyed said that they went through some kind of significant crisis point. But the point is that it doesn't really make as much sense that it's like age triggered. It's definitely like event triggered, right? So it's not like you turned 50 and it's like your 50th birthday, all of a sudden some kind of psychological thing happens. It's that things happen things happen throughout your life, and they happen during this stage too. Like, for example, like the loss of a parent, right? Like these major life events that make you question everything. It's not like age specific, although it tends to happen at this stage because, well, there's other interesting factors. We also tend to get more philosophical as we get older. And getting more philosophical can be positive or negative depending on the quality of your philosophy. And midlife does present some physical challenges. I smile, not laughing at that, but just like, man, tell me about it. Sometimes when I put up my old man back or whatever, and it's like, it can take the wind out of your sail for a while. So the next two concepts I want to discuss and have you be able to distinguish between are role transition and role conflict. Okay, so these are both situations. Remember role. Okay, so remember role as if like, say we're making a movie of your life and you're the main character, but now we gotta get somebody to play the role of your boyfriend and the role of your boss and the role of your friend at school, and so it's like that, right? Now what this is saying is sometimes it's this idea of uh, so role strain is within the one role. Okay, so what I'm going to say is sometimes the stress comes because, say, like right now for you guys, your student role is probably very stressful, right? And for people that have kids at home, maybe the mom role is super stressful too. And so you have role strain in both of those. Now, when doing, I'm getting ahead of myself. This is next slide. When doing homework and kid yelling is at the same time, we would actually call that role conflict. Okay, so it's not about stress level, it's about that it's two things. Role strain is within one of those two things. So when like school becomes too much or when parenting becomes too much. So what I'm saying is we experience both strain at an individual level and strain at a complex level. It's not one or the other, it's two elements of or two levels of analysis. Okay, all of us occupy these multiple roles all the time, which predicts friction at all kinds of levels. One concept in psychology that's useful for understanding this, now I'm just reading the slide, but is this idea of role strain, that stress that occurs when a person lacks the resources needed to fulfill a role. The resources, that's just a fancy language. I'll put that in your language right now. You don't feel like you have enough time left to do all the assignments that are left before next Friday or whatever. That's role strain. That's also though what will make you stronger if you can do it. That's why college matters. Accomplishing tasks and being able to knock down tasks is huge. Adults may need to return to college, learn new skills, which may be anxiety provoking. Okay, so just like how I was saying that role strain is like being overwhelmed as a parent or being overwhelmed as a student. Role conflict is when these two things are hitting. So here's a classic picture of like a mom running, and she's got a baby in one arm and she's trying to pull along her kid, and you can see she's got like a laptop there and her lunch, and there's a clock that's going super fast, and there's mail and bills in her purse and car keys, and it's like that's role conflict. Okay, so it's not like one's worse or one's better. It's like, are you talking about one thing or the dynamics, the complex of multiple factors? So role conflict is any situation in which two or more roles, mom and student, student and worker, friend and boyfriend, right? So like say for example, your boyfriend and your friends don't get along. I don't know, that's not a good example. Maybe it, like your boyfriend or your girlfriend wants to hang out all the time right now, and you're like, pretend the coronavirus thing wasn't going on, but you're like, I need to focus on my studies and keep your social distance. No, I'm just joking. Okay, for example, simultaneously caring for teenage children and aging parents. Okay, so the example I was using before of like, or that's actually coming up of sandwich generation. So when you get to this stage or later in life where you're um, taking care of your older parents and maybe still supporting your younger kids. And we'll talk about that in a sec. But that would be role strain. Your strain as a daughter and your strain as a mom role conflict. Okay, so I'll end that slide by being confusing. Let me say this one more time clearly. Role transition is within one thing. Role conflict is between two things. They're both getting stressed out by life. Okay, you guys are like, will this slide ever end? But that's an important distinction. Role conflict, role strain. I'll just let you look at the picture for a sec. I've been just rambling like crazy. Right, so is it role strain all within the student role? Or is it role conflict within your role as a worker and a student and a son or a daughter? That's the easiest way to think about it. How many factors are involved? Different factors. So the good news is marital stability and satisfaction increases in midlife. So as you get to midlife, people's marriages tend to get stronger, and they tend to self-rate them as better, more satisfying, right? One big reason is less fighting over kid-related stuff. Who's going to change the diaper? Who's going to do this? Who's going to take them here? When that dies down a little bit, increased self-control, same thing, is like having more time to do the things that you like to do and having less of this feel of like having to fight for your own time to do that, which can be the constant reality when you have kids. Not that I'm complaining, but can I get an amen from the other parents? Okay. Identification of successful problem-solving strategies. Okay, that's like the most important part. I like this term, skilled diplomacy, that the textbook uses. It's hilarious because like diplomacy is such a politics word that means like there's tensions between the States and Russia, so both countries send a diplomat to do diplomacy to try to work things out, and it's like that's like within the relationship that you get better at, more skilled in your diplomacy, more skilled in your problem-solving strategies. Yep, skilled diplomacy, key to long-term relationships in general, but definitely marriage. Just a fancier way of saying like how you argue is important. Okay, so as we get into middle adulthood, the role within the family starts to, this is what we're going to call a sandwich generation. It starts to go in both directions. So what I mean by that is say you're 50 and you have 70-year-old parents who are starting to maybe decline a bit in health, but you also have maybe 25-year-old kids who are maybe still living at home. And so you're financially supporting the kids and you're financially maybe paying for the nursing home or whatever for the parents. So you're assisting in both directions. In middle adulthood, the family role involves giving assistance in both directions of the generational chain. Right? So I like this picture of the guy with like the baby stroller and the grandpa's wheelchair, just because it kind of nicely shows he's in between those two roles. He's the dad and the son, helping the grown child and supporting aging parents. So you can easily see how this idea of the sandwich generation, this is flip mirror for me, so you're seeing the opposite of what I'm saying, but you see the grandpa on one side and the kid on the other side, and the son and the son/dad in the middle being sandwiched, right? So that's where that term comes in, that the person becomes like in a sandwich between the generation before and after them. This stage in life, we must shoulder responsibility for maintaining affectional bonds. So there's a lot of pressure to kind of keep things solid in both direction. Between 40 and 65, adults give help more than they receive in both directions. So statistically, when you're between 40 and 65, it's likely that you're helping other people in your family more than you're being helped. More than any other time statistically in your life. And this is just saying the same thing in a chart. Okay, so the orange one there that my head's kind of covering says help received from parents. So you can kind of see it's peaking in this 40 to 65 kind of range. So you've probably heard this term before, emptying the nest, which is obviously like a metaphorical comparison to birds. And when the babies leave the nest, and it kind of in English is a common term that means when the kids move out of the house. And when you ask moms about this, they actually respond rather positively, which none of us love to hear, right? Because we want to think like, oh, when we move out, it's like they're like lost without us. But actually, when women are asked about positive and negative transitions in their life, they more often bring this up as a positive. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't love their kid or whatever. It just means maybe some of those things we've been talking about, like having more free time, having more control, having more space, which is changing with some of this boomerang stuff, right? Or the word there, adolescence, which you can kind of see is just a combination of the word adult and adolescent. This kind of, well, and sometimes it's for very normal reasons, right? Maybe it's because the kids moved out for a bit and then they're going back to school, so they're moving home to save money, or they're moving home before they're getting married, or for whatever reason, it's not as clear as like living at home until you're 16 and then moving out and you're out for good, that they're moving back in. That's where that boomerang word comes, right? Where a boomerang is like a stick that you throw and it comes back. Also, younger adults are marrying later, having kids later. So it's changing that dynamic where a few generations ago, like everybody was out of the house. Not even a few generations ago, like one generation ago. So one of the major new family roles at this stage of life is obviously becoming a grandparent. And this can, part of it is becoming a grandparent, and then the other part is possibly adding new family members through in-laws. So for example, if I use like my parents as an example, they have grandkids now, but they also have 3 new children-in-law, is a weird way of saying it, but they have 2 new daughter-in-laws and a new son-in-law. Okay, most grandparents express high levels of satisfaction with this role. Grandparents can positively influence children's development. I think that's a really important point. And it's a point that we don't act on enough in the West. I think for a lot of societies throughout time, elders have played key roles in raising kids. And I think the evidence is pretty clear that both groups benefit huge from that. And maybe there should be a bit more focus on that. I don't have any super specific thing to say about that, but it's clear, the research is clear, that time spent with grandparents can have a massively positive influence on a child, especially in scenarios where there's been a divorce or something, especially when there's less parental stability maybe in general. Shout out to my mom and my sister's kid, Bennett. And I usually use this slide to just talk about how when my mom was going through cancer treatment and how much being a grandmother instead of just a cancer patient, how much that identity piece was therapeutic for her. So it's a little bit weirder talking about this slide with just in my basement by myself, but in class usually we have a good talk about this. So of course, not all grandparents are heavily involved. About 30% or so, 29% of grandparents have a remote relationship with their kids, meaning that they don't see them very frequently. Remote meaning far away or not connected. Less direct influence on their development, obviously, just because of less exposure. And when you ask them, it's usually for physical distance reasons. Now, not always, but that's the most common reason cited. Okay, so I just said 30% or 29% remote relationship. Okay, just over half of grandparents report having a companion relationship. So this is the most common, obviously, right? So over 50% of grandparents report having kind of a warm, pleasurable relationship, enjoy seeing them, but are kind of glad that they're not in a primary caregiving role. And then about 15% reported as uninvolved. Okay, so this is where, or sorry, not uninvolved, involved. Now, this is scenarios where grandma's basically providing, or grandpa, but I say grandma, statistically, it's almost always grandma. I should say grandma or grandpa, but statistically, again, it's almost always grandma. If you just look at straight demographic information. So I'll start that point again, that 16% of grandparents would be classified as involved. So this means that they have basically everyday parenting, everyday involvement. So I would say both my mom and my wife's mom could be considered involved, in the sense that, like, well, especially it's kind of tough because my kid goes to my wife's mom's her grandmas, like most days, or to my mom's, her other grandmas, as pre-COVID and when the world was, functioning how it was like a month ago. I'm not laughing because this isn't a laughing situation, but you know what I mean. Um, and first of all, right now my daughter is missing her two grandmas like crazy. It's one of the biggest issues we're dealing with right now. I actually had to have my mom drive by the house today and just like kind of talk to Evie from a distance, just to like, because she's with them all the time. They have an involved relationship. They're everyday participants in their life. Now, she still lives with us and stuff. Now, there's definitely scenarios where, you know, in a situation where Evie starts going to school, the relationship would probably start to become classified more as companion level, because some involved scenarios could be as involved as the child living with grandma or grandpa like all the time. And when I say it's usually grandma, I'm just saying there's lots of scenarios of grandpas playing that support role, and it's very likely. Just like how when I said in a different point that if there's an older parent in the family that has dementia, it's often the daughter or the daughter-in-law that is taking care of them. It's not sexist, that's just demographic information. So this might be self-evident, but full-time custodial grandparenting, so like the kid being with grandparents all the time, is more likely when the mom isn't married. So if mom's not married, that kid's grandma taking care of them all the time is more likely. Sometimes it's so the daughter can go back to school, so mom can go back to school. So this is kind of interesting. When you ask people about what they think a grandmother is and what you think a grandfather is, what you see is that people's answers in the textbook kind of goes in a lot more into this and where this point comes from. Same with all these points. You can find a lot more in the textbook. These are kind of summary presentations. But this idea that how people define what a grandma is and what a grandpa is different, and there tends to be a more broad, wide-ranging set of ways that people experience or describe their grandparents, their grandmas. The role of grandmother is more broad and more intimate than the grandfather. I could have just said that way more clear. Okay, for most adults in middle age, grandparenthood is not central to their life. So take that with a grain of salt, because that doesn't mean that they don't find it important. What it means is that I remember after my grandma Walsh passed, so my mom's mom, hearing that she used to play basketball and was good. And I was like, what? Grandma played basketball? Like, in my mind, she was always my grandma. I never really, even though I knew it, I never really pondered the fact that she was once a teenager, let alone an athlete. And what I mean by that is, like, I just see her as grandma, but it's like they don't just see themselves as just that, even though that's a really important part of their life. For most adults in middle age, grandparenthood is not central to how they define their life or their sense of self or their overall morale. Not central to, meaning it's not definitional of, doesn't mean it's not a huge component to it. Just means that they have dynamic, layered social lives just like other stages in life. Okay? Caring for aging parents. Adults often feel a strong sense of filial responsibility. That's a word that means filial responsibility. I want you to know that word for the test is, it just means this idea that I have an honor or an oath to take care of my parents. This is an Eastern idea. So in a lot of Asian cultures, this is a big thing. And it's related to this idea of viewing parents as elders. Now, this is something that just seems like a random point, but usually in class we go on big talks about this. When caring for aging parents, caregivers often get this thing called caregiver burnout, which is almost like, well, just think about, we don't need a technical definition. It's like, say you're my age, and say I'm like, my parents right now, thank God, are healthy, knock on wood. But if they weren't, and I had to like go and try to help them, and then come home and still have to do everything with Evie, and then still have my normal job, and still have to whatever, and it's like the likelihood of me and my wife spending this time together, all this stuff, like, so that's why I'm saying it like can affect marital satisfaction. It can make people feel depressed and burdened. It's not, and the thing is, it's not that they, burdened implies that you're negative towards it, but it's not. It's like, it's burdened as in this idea of weight. It's like they have weight on them. If I was like to say, I'm going to increase your burden, that's like your knapsack, your backpack is 10 pounds. I'll put another 10 pounds in it. Now it's 20 pounds. Now you have more burden. Right in the side I say, notice the love and the exhaustion. Okay, so a couple more things about caring for older parents. Caregivers often don't have children at home and tend to be, statistically at least, the kids living closest to the parents. Of course, not always the case. 90% of caregivers for those with Alzheimer's are daughters or daughters-in-law. So I referenced that as if I had said it earlier, but if you watch this presentation backwards, that would work. Okay, intervention can help ease caregiver burden by providing information, blah, 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 about resources or encouraging support groups. That's just saying that there's a lot, I said blah, 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 but it's not like that's not important. The idea is that there's a lot of things that can be provided, a lot of resources, a lot of support, a lot of even just knowing what to look for, knowing that when you're doing that kind of thing, the tendency to get depressed, to negatively evaluate your close relationships, to get frustrated with people, to be short with people, has increased and is affecting your behavior. And it's not that you're going crazy, it's that you're experiencing caregiver burden. It's a psychological term. So you look at this picture and you're like, who's that guy in the middle with the cool shades and the cool white shirt and red hat? It's like, your cool prof zip lining. That was a lame intro to the slide, but anyways, I wanted to show this picture. This is from my buddy Uriah's stag weekend. We went zip lining at this cool place, and I wanted to put this up because one thing that's clear in the research is that even though when we get older, we don't have maybe as many friends, especially as many kind of surface level peripheral friends, the total number in adult friends is lower. However, they tend to remain intimate and close, meaning you might have less friends, but tight friends. Okay, and that these friendships tend to endure with less frequent contact. And I think about, I've used him as an example before, my buddy Chris Orson. It's like I cannot see him for 2 years and then hang out with him, and it's like we never missed a minute because we grew up playing sports together. We've been through so much together, and we both recognize like he lives, up near Bracebridge now. And it's like it's not because we don't want to hang out. It's because he has, his whole life up there, and I have my whole life down here. And but friendships endure even with less frequent contact. Again, some of these like family picture slides make more sense when we're having like a lot of in-person conversations about this stuff. This is my wedding party. My wife had 10 bridesmaids, so I had to bring my whole soccer team. No, these are all my good buddies, and also my sister-in-law, who's also a good buddy. And yeah, at this point in the course or in the class, I'm just like talking about how important these kind of people are in my life from a psychological stability perspective, from a friendship perspective. So we're getting towards the end, but I want to come back for a second to this. So remember, in this course, we've been talking quite a bit at times about the Big Five personality, and we started earlier in the course talking about how when a child's born, it's kind of more accurate to talk about their temperament, and that as their temperament, or they're born with this kind of style or temperament that's different amongst different kids. And we talked about how they're different in activity levels and attention span, and in how they're negative in their positive approach, and their inhibition and all that kind of stuff. And that then that interacts with their environment, and over time their personality starts to develop. And there's all these things about personality, but if you kind of really boil it down, right? And in class I use the example of like you start to realize that if you're asking all these questions, if I'm getting you to do a scale on how happy you are, and a scale on how joyous you are, and a scale on how lovely you think the world is, and that's a weird one, but I start to realize, like, if I know your answer on one, I know your answer on all of them, and we keep doing that, and we can reduce personality to basically these 5 traits. How open are you to experience? Why it says ocean is just a mnemonic, just a memory trick to an acronym, sorry. Just a type of mnemonic, whatever. Okay, openness to experience, conscientiousness, rule following, kind of being tidy, being worried about other people's opinion of what you're doing, so like we talked about how conscientiousness is an important predictor of things like school performance, introversion and extroversion, your level of agreeableness, and your level of neuroticism, or your kind of tendency towards a negative emotion, neurotic emotion. Okay, so why did I bring up this big 5 again? Okay, and I think one thing that's interesting about the big 5 is its ability to maintain stability over time. So you've heard me rant in class about how psychometrics, or just any of these tests that are psychometric, meaning psycho meaning like psychology, and then metric meaning like a measurement. So a psychometric test is any kind of thing where you're doing a survey and then people are like, oh, you scored this, which means this. That's like a measure of your psychology. It's a psychometric. Okay, now what's important for these psychometrics is that they're stable over time, so think about it. It's like if you come up to me and you're like, oh, I got this new test that can prove if you're going to be good at this, and I take the test and I score a certain way, and then I do it again later in the afternoon, I score totally different, then I score totally different the next day. It's like it's not measuring anything necessarily, right? Anything stable, right? But these personality scores are interesting because they're stable over time, right? You'd score similar next year to how you scored this year, and then 5 years from now. Okay, so it's relatively stable even to old age. Now, having said that, there are some predictable changes. So what that means is, like, in general, this stays stable, but for everyone, there's some things that we can kind of predict about when we get older. We tend to get less open to new experiences, less extroverted, and less neurotic. So what's in easier language, we tend to get less, as we get older, we tend to get less wanting to do always new things. Again, this is in general, statistical average. We tend to get kind of locked into what we like. I'm already like that. I've made the joke in class before. It's like, every time me and my wife go out for dinner, I could just go to Eastside Mario's and have a chicken parm and be happy. It's like, I'm cool with that. I don't need to try a new restaurant and have my like old man habits. You know, more extroverted, or less extroverted, I mean. Right? Extroversion goes down, more introverted, more, well, we talked about all that difference. I don't want to rehash all that, but basically more introverted, just meaning more kind of seeking time for, introverted is like wanting to, when you have, the big way to understand this is, the question is like, what do you do when you're feeling worn down? Do you want to be around other people to kind of bring your spirits back up in a more extroverted way, or do you want to kind of spend some time by yourself, maybe read a book, maybe go for a walk? Like for me, the other day I was in a mental rut, and so I went for a long walk, and that really like helped me. That's a very like introverted thing to do, even though it's helpful for every type of person. Remember, it's not like you're one or the other, it's a spectrum. Less negative emotion in general, right? People tend to get more agreeable more conscientious. So what this means is like in general, our scores are relatively stable. So you say you're here and I'm here on one of these things, and it might predictably go up or down with age. The hand gestures didn't work there, but I think you know what I'm saying. And if you don't, ask me in the next Zoom. Okay, at this stage in life, also in terms of career, work satisfaction tends to be about at its peak. This is when you survey people about how much they like their jobs, this is where statistically people tend to rate it the highest. Quality of work performance actually remains really high. So this is interesting. Actually, the old workers at a company often outperform the younger workers, despite what people might think. Middle-aged workers experience less burnout than others, linked to some of those other things. Right, like not having little kids, keeping them up at night. Careers are more stable in middle age. Okay, so this is kind of an interesting finding from more so from a field called occupational psychology or behavioral psychology, looking at the workplace that actually, and you see this even with some of these Navy SEAL tournaments they do every year, and you'd think like the young 19-year-old, 20-year-old Navy SEAL wins, and some like 34-year-old guy wins, and it's like, some old dogs have learned a lot of tricks. All right, job performance actually remains high throughout middle adulthood. Now, obviously, there's exceptions for jobs that require like super speedy reaction or physical strength. That same idea I just said doesn't necessarily hold true for like sprinting or MMA fighting or something like that. Now, I shouldn't have to explain to any Canadians who Vince Carter is. But I think this is an interesting example, right? The Vince Carter, unfortunately, because of this COVID stuff and the league shutting down, might have played his last game already. Hopefully, if the league restarts up, that won't be true. This season, I'm just saying that because this is probably his last season. So if it doesn't restart and we don't start till next season, he might not play again. Definitely the player that put Toronto on the map. Now he's playing for the Atlanta Hawks. Why I'm highlighting him here, he's currently the oldest player in the NBA at 43 years old. Think about that. The average player in the NBA is 26. Why is Vince Carter still in the NBA? Because he learned how to focus on what was needed and focus on the skills that he could still do. When he was 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, he was doing those kind of tomahawk dunks all the time. He can still actually dunk at 43, but now he's helping develop the younger players, playing good defense, shooting three-pointers. It's like he's learned what he can still do, and he's optimizing that because that's still rewarded. He's selectively optimizing things that are compensated. He's basically learning what is valued, right? So people don't need him to do reverse spin dunks all the time. But if he can be a really good influence on the young guys, if he can be awesome in practices, if when he goes in the game he can play solid D and hit a couple of shots and just play basic, he doesn't have to be superstar anymore. He can be your 10th best player now. And the 10th best player in an NBA player is still one of the top, 300 basketball players in the world. Right? That's how he's 43 in a league where the average person's 26. He's selected, meaning he's not treating everything the same. He's focusing on certain things and getting as good as he can at that, optimizing it, because those are things that are rewarded, right? So that doesn't mean he's like, maybe you could be like, well, you could selectively optimize. You could put all your time into training how to do a fancy dribble around your legs, but no one cares that you do that. It's not compensated, right? It's like, it's important that what you're selecting to put your time into is something that people actually care about you putting your time into it. You're selecting the right thing. You're actually working hard and optimizing it. And you made the right choice. You understand the system and you pick something that's actually compensated within that system. Selective optimization with compensation. Once you kind of get your head around that tongue twister of a title, that concept is a helpful idea in psychology. The simpler way of saying it is you kind of, you've been around the block. It's not your first rodeo. You've experienced life before, and you've taken a few bumps, and it's adjusted how you now are, and you've learned that actually things aren't all the same, and some things are more worth your time than others, and you let that actually shape your behavior, and then you're selectively optimizing with compensation, and then you're cooking with gas. Okay, so this idea that adults, through this idea of selective optimization with compensation, that once you understand this selective optimization with compensation, say that 10 times fast, you understand why we don't see more of a dip in performance and why these older adults actually outperform younger ones. It's this link between selection, optimization, and compensation. So what they're focusing on, how well they're focusing on it and actually getting good. So selection is what they're focusing on. Optimization means like getting actually really, really good at something, and then making sure that the thing that you're good at is something that people care that you're good at, so that they'll pay you for it or whatever, reward it, compensate it. The link between selection, optimization, and compensation and the quality of work performance actually strengthens with age. There's just 2 more slides, and this age group that's currently this age group right now in Canada is the group that we call the boomers generation. This boomer generation is projected to be the healthiest, best educated, longest living retirees in human history. It's an interesting point. Baby boomer cohorts are now in their middle age, making retirement plans for both their wife and husband. This is what's interesting though. Most people, and this is where life expectancy changes things, right? So like, say everybody's retiring at 60 and they're dying in, it's a cold way of talking about it, but they're dying at 75. That's 15 years of benefits basically. But if they're dying at 92 and retiring at 60, now you're talking about like 32 years of benefits. And I'm not saying not to pay it. I'm just saying it changes the dynamic of working years, the ratio of working years to benefit receiving years. Right? So a lot of people are expecting to live into their 60s. To retire in their early 60s and live into their 80s. Many have not saved enough to do that and accumulated too much debt. If you're 20 now, start your retirement savings. Put $50 every paycheck into a retirement savings, and then have your bank do it automatically. You get paid every second Thursday. If you can't do 50 each time, put 20 bucks in, 25 bucks in every second week. That's 50 bucks a month. If you're 19, by the time you're 65, that'll be your goose egg to retire on. Your golden egg, I meant to say. Goose egg. Do that. Go call your bank and start your retirement savings when you're young. That's the best financial advice I'll ever give you. Okay, next slide. Yeah, so check out this. This is saying today there's about 7 caregiving age taxpayers for every person over 80. By 2030 in Canada, it looks like there'll be 4. And by 2050, there'll be 3. Right? It's nothing about that. What's that saying? It's like for every older person that is getting benefits from the system. And it's not like we're paying them. Remember, they worked their whole life and contributed to old age security. They deserve that money. It's not like we're being generous charity givers giving people old age pension. That's stuff they paid into. But if now we have basically 7 people for every 1 person that's getting that, once it gets down to 3, under half that many people, the individual burden on each Canadian is going to be huge. And that's why, well, in general, that's called the graying of the Canadian society. If you just kind of Google graying of Canada, you'll see interesting ideas of how Canada as a country is getting older. And there's social implications for that. But again, different topic for a different channel, or not different channel, but a different video. Love you guys. And with that, you are now ready for test 3. and we completed the course in terms of presentations in this class. But again, like I said, it's not like this channel is going anywhere, and more content coming, and I still owe you guys that additional content if it is desired, or if you guys want it. Okay, anyways, without further ado, thanks for taking the time to watch this. We're right about an hour, and hang in there. We're just about there. You guys are going to do this. Okay, cheers.